The creatures who created the White Walkers were not destroyers. They were not evil, not cruel, not the ancient enemies of life. They were its oldest guardians, and the most catastrophic act in the history of Westeros was carried out by hands that spent 10,000 years tending forests, singing to animals, and weaving the deepest magic this world has ever seen. The children of the forest created the Night King. Let that land before anything else tonight. Let your breathing slow now. Let whatever you carried into this evening begin gently to set itself down. There is no urgency here. There is no problem that needs solving in the next 2 hours, no decision that cannot wait until morning finds you. You are resting. The story will come to you in the dark, the way the oldest stories always come. Not loudly, not insistently, but with the quiet persistence of something that has been waiting a very long time to be heard. Go back with me now, not years, not centuries, 12,000 years back, past the rise and fall of every dynasty and every conquest, past the raising of the wall and the forging of the first sword, past every name that history has ever troubled to remember. Go back to a Westeros that no human eye has ever seen, because no human was yet there to see it. What existed then is almost beyond imagining if you approach it the way we approach most history, as a series of events and their causes and their consequences. The ancient world of the children of the forest does not work that way. It was not a series of events. It was a condition, a sustained state of being, a world in such careful and complete relationship with itself that the concept of event, of things departing sharply from their ordinary course, barely applied. 12,000 years ago, and perhaps far longer, the continent of Westeros was forest, not a place that contained forests. Forest, essentially and entirely, from the glacial permanence of the far north to the warm lowlands of what we now call Dorne. An unbroken canopy stretched across the width of the known world, and beneath that canopy, in the dappled and layered dark where the oldest trees held the light and the oldest roots drank whatever the rains sent down, a people lived. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify. Link in the description. They called themselves the Singers, or the Children of the Earth. The name by which we know them, the Children of the Forest, was given to them by the first men who arrived much later. And it is the name of outsiders, the kind of name that newcomers give to people who are already there, which is rarely the most accurate name, but is almost always the name that survives. They were small, 3 to 4 feet tall by most accounts, and accounts are scarce enough that even this detail deserves to be held gently. Their eyes were large, gold or green, or a deep bronze, depending on the fragment you are reading, and they were set wide in faces that the earliest human observers found unsettling without being able to say precisely why, as though something in the architecture of those faces suggested a different relationship to time than the human face usually implies. Their skin was mottled and dappled in patterns that recalled the bark of old trees, grey and brown and faintly green in the lower light of the forest floor, and this was not coincidental. The children were adapted, across tens of thousands of years, to the specific environment they had inhabited since before the concept of inhabitation existed as a concept. A person of ordinary eyesight could stand within 3 feet of a child of the forest, pressed against an ancient oak, and see nothing but the oak. The forest kept them the way the forest keeps all its oldest secrets. In plain sight, perfectly invisible to anyone who does not know how to look. They moved through the great canopy with a lightness that left no trace, harvested what the forest offered without altering what it offered, and lived in the hollows of great trees and in the deep places beneath root systems that had been growing since before any human civilization had learned to write its own name. They used weapons of bone and dragonglass, the volcanic glass that maesters call obsidian, the same black material that Jon Snow will one day carry to Dragonstone and lay before a queen who is trying to understand why it matters. In the children's hands, dragonglass was everyday technology. Hunting tools, cutting instruments, the material from which rituals were performed. They had no iron, no bronze, no agriculture. As human societies understand that word, their relationship to the living world was not one of extraction, but of something closer to conversation, a reciprocal exchange in which they took what was offered and maintained, in return the conditions under which the forest could continue to offer it. They tended the land the way a musician tends an instrument, not to own it, not to transform it, but to keep it capable of making the sounds it was made to make. It is worth pausing here in the dark, with this image of a world that no human record has ever fully described. Imagine an entire continent, the full width and length of Westeros, without a single human footprint, without a single cleared field, a single road, a single wall or fence or midden heap. A continent that has been lived in and tended for tens of thousands of years, by a people who left it at the end of all that time essentially unchanged. Not because they lacked intelligence or imagination or ambition, but because their relationship to the land was so fundamentally different from the human relationship that the very concept of transformation was foreign to their way of thinking. The children of the forest did not change landscapes. They read them, listened to them, participated in them. This is perhaps the hardest thing for any of us, in any world, to genuinely understand. The idea of presence without alteration. Of being somewhere, fully and completely, without leaving a mark. They worshipped nothing and everything, which amounts to the same thing when you understand it properly. They did not kneel before gods who lived elsewhere and intervened from a distance. They understood the divine as something that moved through the world they inhabited, through the roots of the weirwood trees, through the movement of rivers over stone, through the slow breathing of the forest across the long rhythm of the seasons. Their religion, if that word is even adequate, was participation rather than petition. They did not pray for rain. They understood themselves as one element in the system that produced rain, and their rituals were acts of maintenance, of tending, of keeping, of ongoing conversation with forces that were neither personal nor impersonal, neither loving nor indifferent, but present. Simply, deeply, continuously present. The weirwood trees were at the centre of all of it. The pale-barked trees with their blood-red leaves and their carved faces, those watching expressions that seem to follow you across every godswood in Westeros, that feel as though they know something you have not said aloud, were not simply sacred symbols to the children. They were instruments, nodes in a network that stretched across the entire continent, root systems interlocking far beneath the surface of the earth, carrying between them something that was not water and not nutrients, but was closer to information, to memory, to the accumulated awareness of everything that had ever happened in proximity to a weirwood tree, reaching back across the entire depth of the children's history on this continent. The children carved those faces not to create objects of worship, but to create receivers, points of contact between the physical world Beld and the vast, slow intelligence of the network itself. The Greenseers were those among the children who could access this network most fully. Not all children had the gift equally, and those who did could sink their consciousness into the Weirwood web and see across enormous distances, not only of space but of time. They could look backward, witnessing moments that had occurred centuries before their own birth. Not as guesses or reconstructions, but as direct experience, the way you might close your eyes and relive something from your own past. The trees held the memory. The Greenseer opened the door, and what they found in the deep archive of everything the Weirwood network had observed was a history of this continent that no human scholar has ever fully accessed. A record that stretches back past the coming of the first men, past the long night, past every event that human records treat as foundational, into a time so remote that it exists now only in the grain of certain trees, and the dreams of certain people who do not know what they are dreaming. Their language is almost entirely lost to us. The true tongue of the children of the forest has left almost no trace in the historical record. A few fragments in songs that the first men transcribed so imperfectly that even those transcriptions are unreliable. A few sounds that Bran Stark will hear in his dreams and be unable to hold when he wakes. But the language was real, and it was unlike anything human. It did not have the grammar that human languages share, the arrangements of subject and object, the tenses that locate events in time. It was organized more like music than like speech, a system of tones and rhythms and silences, whose meaning was not in individual sounds, but in the patterns those sounds made together. To learn it required not memorization, but a fundamental change in the way you organized sound into meaning. It was a language for a people who heard the world differently than we do. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify, link in the description. When Bran Stark first pushes his consciousness into the Weirwood tree in Winterfell's Godswood, when he finds himself inside a vision of his father, kneeling in that same Godswood, and calls out, and Ned Stark's head turns toward a voice no one else can hear. What Bran has accidentally touched is the edge of the same network that the children maintained for 10,000 years. He does not understand it yet. He does not have the framework. But in that moment, something in the tree recognizes him in a way that has nothing to do with vision or prophecy, or the supernatural mechanisms that fantasy usually uses to explain such things. The tree recognizes him because the Stark connection to the Weirwoods is not accidental or symbolic. It is an inheritance, passed forward across 12,000 years of proximity and reverence, arriving now in the body of a boy who has just begun to understand what he carries. Ned Stark himself, kneeling each morning before the Weirwood tree with his greatsword laid before him and his eyes open to the falling leaves, practices something that his maester's learning cannot fully explain, and his Andal-influenced culture cannot entirely honor. The old gods of the first men are the gods of the children of the forest, filtered through thousands of years of human adoption, stripped of most of their original context, reduced to a carved face and a habit of silent kneeling, but still, in their deepest structure, the same communion. The godswoods that persist in every northern castle are remnants of a world the children built, maintained not as deliberate preservation, but as a habit so old it has become identity. When Ned prays in that way of his, without words, without ceremony, with only his presence and his patience, he is speaking a language he does not know he knows. And the tree, which has been listening since before any Stark stood before it, Here's, let your breathing slow a little further now. The ancient world is around you, not as something to investigate or analyze or hold, but as a presence, the way the oldest things are present when you stop making enough noise to drown them out. The children of the forest were patient in a way that only something very old and very knowing can be patient. They are patient still, in the roots beneath every godswood, in the grain of the weirwood faces, in the quality of silence that certain northern places have at night, when no one is speaking and the wind has paused. You do not need to carry any of this. The history will keep. The roots continue their slow work in the dark. And now your watch, for this first quiet hour, is ended. Let the forest hold you. Let the pale trees stand their vigil at the edges of your sleep. But to understand the true weight of what the children built, and what they would eventually lose, we need to understand not just where they lived, but what they were. Not as myth, not as legend, but as a living, breathing, singing people. And what they were is stranger, and more extraordinary, and more heartbreaking than any account of them has ever quite allowed. There is a question that arises in any honest investigation of the children of the forest, and it is a question that the historical record tends to avoid with what feels like deliberate discomfort. The question is whether the children were, in the sense that matters most to the kind of story we are tracing tonight, persons. Not in the biological sense, that much is beyond serious dispute. But in the deeper sense, were they minds capable of grief and longing, and the slow accumulation of meaning across centuries? Were they beings who loved specific places and specific others, and felt the weight of loss when those things were taken from them? The answer that emerges from everything the Weirwood network eventually showed to Bran Stark, and from the fragments that survive in the oldest songs, is yes. Profoundly, uncomplicatedly, heartbreakingly yes. Let your breathing remain slow and steady. You are settling now, deeper into the quiet, deeper into the specific dark of very old things, the dark of deep forests at night, of spaces beneath roots where light has never reached, of silence that has been uninterrupted for so long that it has become a kind of substance. It is not the dark of absence or threat. It is the dark of depth, of the kind of quiet that only exists in places that have not been disturbed for a very long time. Let it hold you. There is nothing you need to do in this dark except rest and listen. And the listening itself requires nothing from you except the willingness to be still. The children of the forest lived far longer than humans. The accounts are fragmentary, filtered through generations of human retelling, suggest lifespans of perhaps 300 years, which is neither the immortality of the others nor the brief and urgent arc of a human life, but something in between, with its own particular implications. A child of the forest in their 2nd century was still in something approximating what humans might call early middle age. Their entire relationship to time was structured differently as a result. When a child of the forest encountered a human being, they were encountering a creature whose full life, from birth through the depth of experience that humans call wisdom to the quieting of old age, would pass in the span of what the child would experience as their own adulthood. Whole human generations could be born, grow, teach their children, grow old, and die while a single child watched from the trees and remembered every one of them. They were not immortal. This is worth stating clearly, because the mythology that accumulated around them in human storytelling tended towards the supernatural, and the children were not supernatural. They were natural, more deeply natural perhaps than anything else that has ever lived on Westeros, more fully expressions of the living world rather than occupants of it. They could be killed by weapons. They aged, though slowly, the way rivers age, the way coastlines age, by erosion and accumulation rather than by crisis. A child of the forest in their 3rd century was not the same being they had been in their 1st century, had not the same face, or the same relationship to grief, or the same capacity for surprise. They changed, but they changed at a rate so different from human change that the difference felt to human observers like permanence. The Greenseers among them did not simply have a gift. They became, over the course of their long lives, something that the available language barely covers. As the oldest Greenseers moved deeper into the Weirwood network, sitting at the base of a tree and allowing, over decades, the roots to grow gradually around them, into them, until the distinction between the tree and the person had become biological as well as spiritual. They ceased to be individuals in the ordinary sense and became distributed. Their consciousness thinned and spread through the network, losing the sharp edges of individual experience and gaining instead access to a kind of awareness that was simultaneously everywhere the network reached. The oldest Greenseers did not die. They dissolved into something larger than themselves. Bloodraven, the human Greenseer who waits in the cave beyond the wall for Bran Stark's arrival, is the last practitioner of this art, which is the children's greatest and most costly gift to the world. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. Not as a piece of fantasy world-building, but as a genuine philosophical proposition. The children of the forest found an answer to the problem that has defeated every human civilization since the first one: how to preserve the wisdom of the oldest members of a society beyond the span of any individual life. Humans have tried books, laws, oral traditions, institutional memory, apprenticeship. All of these are copies of copies, transmissions that lose fidelity with each generation, approximations that grow less accurate the further they travel from their origin. The children fed their oldest and wisest members directly into a network that did not copy memory. It retained it, the way amber retains the body of an insect in perfect, exact 3-dimensional preservation. What Bran inherits when he reaches the cave is not teaching in the human sense. It is direct access. The memory intact, the experience unmediated. Their relationship to death was, as a consequence, different from any human relationship to death. They mourned. They felt the particular weight of an absence where a presence used to be. They had the capacity for grief. This is evident in the songs attributed to them, in the pattern of the carvings on the Isle of Faces, in the testimony of the oldest human records of encounters with the children. But their cosmological framework placed death not as an ending, but as a redistribution. The consciousness that had moved through a particular small dappled body for 2 or 3 centuries would, at the end of that body's viability, thin and spread back into the living world, into the roots, the water, the growing things, adding itself to what was already there. This is a beautiful idea. It is also, in all probability, more metaphor than mechanism. But it is the idea they lived inside, and it shaped everything about how they treated the living while the living persisted. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify. Link in the description. The true tongue was organized not like a grammar but like a landscape. Human languages move in time. They arrange subjects and actions and objects in sequences, one after another. The way that a path moves through a forest, one step at a time. The true tongue, according to the fragments that survived into the Maester's records, moved through space rather than time. Its meaning was not located in the sequence of its sounds, but in the relationships between them, The way the meaning of a piece of music is not in any individual note, but in the pattern that all the notes make together simultaneously in the body of the listener. Learning it required not memorization, but a fundamental rewiring of the way the learner organized sensation into meaning. It was a language designed for beings who experienced time differently, who did not need a sequence of words to build toward a point, because their entire relationship to arrival and departure was different from the human relationship. The animals of the great forests responded to the children's songs in ways that the earliest First Men accounts describe with a bewilderment that is itself illuminating. Direwolves, ravens, the great elk whose antlers brushed the underside of the canopy. These creatures did not simply tolerate the children's presence or avoid them out of cautious neutrality. They sought them. They gathered in the places where children lived and sang. They seemed to understand something in the quality of the children's sound that no human observer could name or replicate. This was not the magic of walking in the human sense, not the violent displacement of an animal's consciousness by a human skin changer who takes the animal's body without invitation. It was something that the word conversation almost approximates, though conversation still implies more separation than was actually present. The children and the animals of their forests were not two kinds of beings who happened to communicate. They were aspects of a single living system that had learned, over millennia, to exchange information at the level of song. Their art was not representational. The children did not carve images of their leaders, their battles, their gods in any recognizable divine form. The carvings that survive on the stones of the Isle of Faces, in the oldest strata of places like the Night Fort, in locations so ancient that no human record of their making survives, are all patterns. Spiral and recursive, the kind of patterns that appear in natural systems, the cross-section of a nautilus, the distribution of seeds in a sunflower's face, the branching of rivers seen from a sufficient height. These patterns were not decoration, they were records. The children recorded their history not in narrative, not in the sequence of events and their causes and their consequences that human historians use, but in pattern, in the geometric structure of relationships between things. The mind required to read those records has not existed in Westeros for thousands of years. When Jojen Reed explains Greensight to Bran Stark, when he describes what it is to see forward and backward through time in sleep, to feel the weight of a vision as something more insistent than imagination, to know that what you dreamed was not a dream, in the human sense, but an actual event occurring somewhere in the vast web of what has happened and what will happen. He is using the frameworks of a child raised in the northern tradition of the old gods to describe something that is not fully human in its origin. The gift of Greensight that persists in certain Stark-adjacent bloodlines is a genetic and spiritual inheritance from the long period of close contact between the first men and the children of the forest. It was not engineered or deliberately given. It diffused through intermarriage and proximity and the kind of cultural osmosis that happens wherever two peoples share a boundary long enough. The children of the pact, not specific individuals, but the generations born in its long peace, carried traces of both peoples, and those traces expressed themselves most powerfully in the ability to dream differently than ordinary human sleep allows. Bran himself, lying in his bed in Winterfell, with his mind increasingly loose from the tether of his broken body, is experiencing an awakening that any child of the forest would have recognized immediately. The way the dreams reach for him before he reaches for them. The way the three-eyed crow arrives with a quality of purpose that distinguishes it from the ordinary dream imagery of a child's sleep. The ease with which he slips into his direwolf's awareness, too natural, too comfortable, like remembering something he never knew he had forgotten. He is the continuation of something ancient. Not a chosen one in the sense that human prophecy usually means. A chosen one in the far older sense of being the person in whom a particular inheritance has, after generations of latency, finally arrived at sufficient concentration to become itself again. The children of the forest were not primitive. This is the most important and most frequently misunderstood truth about them. They were differently sophisticated, organized along principles that human civilization has never prioritized, optimized for a relationship with the living world that makes our own relationship to our environment look, by honest comparison, like a child banging on an instrument it has not yet learned to play. What they built was invisible to the human eye because it left no ruins. The children are nearly absent from the archaeological record of Westeros precisely because they built nothing that could fall. Their monument was the forest itself, maintained, tended, kept alive and resonant and connected across tens of thousands of years. That is a kind of monument. It simply does not look like one from the outside. Rest now. Let the thought of that forest settle around you the way a blanket settles, not heavy, just present, just warm, just there. The children's world was a world of slow and patient things. Their story will continue. There is more to tell. But for this moment, the forest is enough. The pale trunks of the weirwood trees are visible at the edges of your vision, if you look toward where the light changes, where the dark deepens into something older. You carry no burden here. Your watch is ended. Sleep gently now. The first men arrived with bronze blades and livestock and a hunger for land. And the world that the children had tended for 10,000 years began to change in ways it had never changed before. What followed was not simply war. It was the collision of two fundamentally incompatible ideas about what the world was for. The Arm of Dorne was not always broken. It is one of those geographic facts that we absorb early, and then stop thinking about entirely. The way we stop questioning anything that has always been true for as long as we have been alive. But once it was true, once, not so very long ago in geological time, there was a narrow land bridge connecting the southeastern tip of Westeros to the eastern continent across a neck of shallow sea. And across that bridge, approximately 12,000 years before the Targaryen conquest, the first men came. Let your breathing remain slow. This is a migration story, which means it is not a story of invasion in the dramatic sense, but something slower and more inexorable. The movement of people following water and pasture, and the pressure of population, with no particular awareness that the land ahead of them already belonged to anyone at all. They came from Essos, the eastern continent, and they came as displaced people always come, not in organized waves, but in the gradual accumulation of individual decisions, family groups following other family groups following the rumor of open land ahead. They brought animals, cattle and horses and dogs, and the particular relentlessness of an agricultural species that has learned to reshape environments in service of its own survival. They brought bronze tools which can do what obsidian and bone cannot: fell trees efficiently, clear fields at scale, build permanent structures on the bones of older ones. And they brought something less tangible than any of these things: the deep human assumption that land exists to be used, that the purpose of a landscape is determined by its potential for human benefit, that the measure of a place is what it can be made to yield. The children of the forest saw them coming. The Greenseers watched through the Weirwood network as the forest at the southern tip of the continent began to change. First slowly, then with increasing speed, as each generation of new arrivals cleared a little more and built a little further north. Trees were being felled, clearings were being burned. The animals the children had known across centuries were being hunted in patterns they had never experienced. Systematically, with the methodical purposefulness of a species that has agriculture in its future and needs more ground to practice it. The children sent singers to the edges of the changed land and listened. And what they heard was a language they could not speak, and a technology they did not possess, and a sheer growing, multiplying number of individuals that was already larger than the entire children's population on the continent. And still more were crossing the Arm. It is essential, before going further, to resist the temptation of the simple moral narrative. The children of the forest are not simply victims. The first men are not simply aggressors. Both of these reductions are failures of imagination, and the history they produce is less true than the history it replaces. The first men were not coming to destroy. They were coming to survive. They had no means of knowing that the forests they entered had been maintained and inhabited for tens of thousands of years, because that maintenance was invisible to them. It left no monuments they could recognize, no boundaries they could see, no declaration of ownership in any form they understood. They were clearing forests the way humans have always cleared forests, because they needed the wood, and they needed the ground. The catastrophic nature of what they were doing was visible only from inside the system they were dismantling. The children's response was everything they had, which was considerable. Do not mistake them for passive sufferers of an inexorable process. They were practitioners of a magic 10,000 years in the making. Deep, slow, rooted magic. The magic of things that grow rather than things that are built. And that kind of magic, while it cannot manufacture a bronze blade or multiply a population by the force of agricultural surplus, can do things that no bronze blade accomplishes. Animals turned against the first men's settlements in coordinated ways that defied the ordinary behavior of individual creatures. Storms arrived from directions the weather had not come from before. The forest seemed to breathe with something that was not quite intelligence, but was close enough to intelligence that the result was indistinguishable. Paths that had been clear became impassable, streams ran backward, and travellers found themselves emerging from the wood at the same point they had entered, no matter how consistently they walked in a straight direction. The greatest of the children's efforts, the most expensive, the most desperate, the one that changed the geography of the world permanently, is what human historians eventually named the Hammer of the Waters. The land bridge at the Arm of Dorne was not always a scatter of islands. It was solid ground, and the children, at the height of their terror at what was already happening to their world, reached into the deepest levels of their magic and broke it. They called something up from beneath the sea floor, something in the tectonic and magical substrate of the earth itself, and the Arm of Dorne cracked and sank and the sea rushed in. The stepstones are what remains, a scatter of islands between the continents, now used by pirates and traders, now crossed by fleets of war, now mapped and charted by meisters who have mostly forgotten that they were once a road. The children made the sea where there had been land. They rewrote the geography of Westeros in a single act of desperate magic. It is worth sitting with the scale of that for a moment. The shattering of the Arm of Dorne is the largest single magical act recorded in the history of Westeros. Larger than the forging of Valyria. Larger than the raising of the wall, the children reshaped a continent because they had no other tool left. And it failed. Not immediately. The hammer of the waters did stop the direct flow of new arrivals across the land bridge, and that was not nothing. But it could not undo what had already happened. The first men who had crossed were already there. Their children had been born in the forest. Their grandchildren had grown up regarding those forests as home, not as territory they had taken from anyone. And eventually, by sea, more came, because human beings have always found a way around the barrier that was supposed to stop them. The hammer bought time. It did not buy a solution. The war that followed lasted 2,000 years. This is the fact that sits at the center of this history, like the god's eye sits at the center of the riverlands. Large, dark, and not easily crossed. 2,000 years of conflict. Not a generation, not a dynasty, not a century, but 20 centuries of sustained and grinding opposition that neither side could win and neither side could end. The children pushed back with magic. The first men pushed forward with numbers and tools. The forests contracted by increments. Each cleared field and felled weirwood, a permanent loss for the children. Each burned settlement a temporary setback for the first men that their population could absorb and replace. The asymmetry was built into the structure of the conflict. The children could slow the process, but they could not reverse it. And the process, slow as it was always moving in one direction. There are places in Westeros where the scars of this war are still legible in the landscape if you know how to read them. The great forests of the north, the Wolf's Wood, the haunted forest beyond the wall, are the remnants of what was once an unbroken canopy that covered the continent. The gaps between them are not natural clearings. They are the accumulated result of 2,000 years of cutting, burning, and farming. Every open field in the Reach, every cultivated valley in the Riverlands, every pastoral stretch of land between one set of trees and the next, represents a portion of the children's world that was taken and never returned. The absence is the monument. The gaps in the canopy are the record. When you look out over the open landscape of southern Westeros and see how empty it is of ancient forest, you are reading the history of what was lost. The first men who lived longest in close contact with the surviving children underwent changes that the historical record notes with curiosity and without fully understanding. They began to approach the weirwood trees with reverence. They developed practices of silent prayer before the carved faces that they could not have inherited from their own culture, because their own culture had no such practice. They began to speak in fragments of forces they did not name, forces in the trees, in the rivers, in the old places of the earth, with a quality of genuine religious feeling that was entirely distinct from the pragmatic spirit propitiation of the early first men religious tradition. Something was transferring across the boundary between the two peoples, moving in the direction of the human side, not because the children were trying to teach, but because proximity, over sufficient time, is its own kind of instruction. The humans were learning to feel what the children had always felt, imperfectly, partially, without the framework that would have made the feeling fully coherent. When Arya Stark runs her hand along the bark of the weirwood tree in the Godswood at Harrenhal and feels something that she cannot name, not comfort, not exactly, but a quality of being heard that she does not usually feel. She is experiencing the residue of this contact. The Stark family are first men stock, among the families with the longest and closest history of living alongside the children's sacred trees. Whatever the first men absorbed from the children's world across 2,000 years of war and 4,000 years of subsequent peace has concentrated in certain bloodlines over the 8,000 years since the Andals came. The Starks carry more of it than most. Not as a conscious belief or a practiced religion in the formal sense, but as an orientation, a way of being in the world, a tendency to trust certain silences and feel uneasy in certain silences, and sense the difference between the two in a way that they would not be able to explain to anyone who did not already know what they were sensing. The war was ending, not through victory, but through exhaustion. Both peoples had been fighting for so long that the fighting had become the world, and the world, after 2,000 years, was ready to imagine something other than itself. A meeting was arranged, a place was chosen, in the middle of the great lake called the God's Eye, on an island entirely covered in weirwood trees. Representatives of the first men and the children of the forest met to speak the words that would end 2,000 years of conflict and begin 4,000 years of a peace so long and so deep that later generations would mistake it for permanence. They were wrong to mistake it for permanence, but the peace was real, and the island where it was made is real still, and the faces carved in its trees have been watching ever since. Let the image settle now, the mist on the God's Eye at dawn, the pale trunks of the weirwoods on the island visible through it, catching whatever light filters through the grey, the sound of water, and beneath the water, the deeper sound of roots. You are resting. The war is over. It has been over for thousands of years, and whatever it cost, it is paid. Let your breathing slow. The forest is still around you. Your watch is ended for this passage. Sleep 2,000 years. That is how long the war between the children of the forest and the first men lasted. Not a generation, not a dynasty, 20 centuries, the entirety of what we call recorded human history. And in those 2,000 years, something happened to both peoples that neither had anticipated. They became, in some essential and irreversible way, the world that the other one lived in. 2,000 years is a span of time that the human mind cannot genuinely hold. We say the words and understand them intellectually. 20 centuries, 60 generations of men and women, born and raised and buried in a conflict that preceded their birth and would outlast their death, but the weight of it refuses to be fully felt. Tonight, in the dark, let it arrive differently. Let 2,000 years be not a measurement, but a feeling, the feeling of something that has been happening since before anyone you have ever loved was born. Something that will continue long after anyone you will ever love is gone. Something that has become not an event in the world, but the shape of the world itself, the texture of the air, the color of the light, the thing against which all other things are defined. Let your breathing be slow and steady. You are resting. The long war is not a thing that threatens you here. It is a thing you are observing from the far shore of history, from a vantage point from which the full length of it is visible. You can see from here what no one inside it could see, that it was not going to last forever, that it was going to end, that it was going to end not in the victory of one side or the destruction of the other, but in the way that the longest conflicts almost always end, in a mutual exhaustion so complete that the idea of continuing becomes literally impossible, becomes something neither people can even properly imagine any longer. The early centuries followed a pattern that any military historian would recognize. The children had the advantage of terrain and deep knowledge. They knew the forests the way only a people who have lived inside them for 10,000 years can know them. And their magic was most potent where the Weirwood network was densest, in the deep wood where the roots interlocked beneath the surface. And the connection between Greenseer and land was strongest. The first men had the advantages of numbers and bronze technology, and most importantly, they had the one strategic asset that ultimately determines the outcome of almost every conflict between an expanding people and a settled one. They had population growth. Every year, there were more of them. Every year, the children's forests sheltered the same number or fewer. The arithmetic was slow, and it was merciless. The children tried things. This needs to be said clearly and held clearly, because the human tendency in reconstructing histories of loss is to render the losing side as passive, as having simply been overwhelmed, as having been victims rather than actors. The children of the forest were actors. They tried everything their 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge gave them access to. They sent magical offensives the histories describe only vaguely, in terms that suggest events too strange for the chroniclers to set down without embarrassment. Forests that moved in ways forests are not supposed to move. Rivers that ran in directions determined by something other than gravity. Animals that behaved as though they had military intelligence rather than animal instinct. None of these things could not hold the line permanently, because none of them could address the core imbalance. The first men's numbers kept growing, while the children's did not. Some of the first men did not participate in the conflict's most destructive phases. The historical record is blurred enough on this point that certainty is impossible, but there are strong suggestions that the 2,000-year war was not uniformly distributed, that certain communities and certain families maintained considerably more careful relationships with the children and with the Weirwood trees than others did. The seeds of the old god's adoption by the first men were planted during the conflict itself, by people living at the edges of the changed land who encountered the children not as enemies, but as neighbors, who heard the true tongue without understanding it, and felt something in its rhythms that resisted classification as enemy communications. The future Northerners, the families who would eventually become the Starks, the Mormonts, the Manderleys, the Mountain Clans, were likely among those who found their way toward coexistence before any formal agreement made coexistence official. The children broke the land bridge. They broke the Arm of Dorne through an act of magic so large that it permanently reshaped the geography of the known world, turning solid land into the scatter of islands now called the Stepstones. The histories that record this event, always from a distance, always filtered through perspectives that did not witness it, describe it as the children's most desperate act. And it was. It was the act of a people who had already tried everything else and found everything else insufficient. They spent some essential portion of what they were on that act, some deep reserve of the magic that had sustained them for 10,000 years, and what they bought with it was time, and the time was not enough, because the first men who had already crossed were already there, and they were already home. It is worth pausing here, in the slow middle of the long war, and noticing something that the histories rarely comment on. Both sides were being changed by the conflict they could not resolve. The first men who came into long contact with the northern forests were not the same people as the first men who had crossed the Arm of Dorne 8 centuries earlier. They had absorbed something from the proximity. They had learned to feel the Weirwood trees as something other than timber. They had begun to treat the carved faces not as primitive art to be defaced or ignored, but as objects that warranted at minimum a cautious respect. Something was accumulating in the human population that had not been there at the start of the conflict, not the children's full understanding of what the trees were and what the network meant, but a shadow of that understanding, a cultural residue, a felt sense that the forest had a quality that ordinary forests did not have. And the children, across the same centuries, were learning something they had not needed to learn before the first men arrived, what it was to be a minority, what it was to fight for space in a world that had previously been entirely theirs, what it was to feel the borders of their territory, not as the natural edges of the world, but as contested lines that could be pushed. This is not a small thing to learn. A people who have been the only people in their world for 10,000 years have a relationship to their own existence that is qualitatively different from a people who have always had to define themselves against others. The children were being changed by the conflict into something that knew itself as a people, as one among others, rather than as simply the inhabitants of a world that was, as far as they had ever known, entirely theirs. By the later centuries of the war, a kind of fatigue had settled into the bones of the conflict that neither side had the energy or the imagination to address directly. The children had retreated from all of the south, from most of the central lands, from the coasts and the river valleys and the great plains that the first men farmed. They remained in the deep forest, the wolf's wood, the vast territories of what would become the north, and beyond the mountains, in the cold forests that human expansion had not yet reached. They were diminished in number, diminished in territory, diminished in the sheer volume of the Weirwood network that connected their Greenseers and carried their memory. They were not broken, but they were tired in a way that goes deeper than bodies, that reaches into whatever in a culture holds its sense of its own continuity. The first men were tired differently. They had land, more land than they could farm, more territory than any 2 or 3 generations could meaningfully settle. The urgent pressure that had driven the original crossing and the early centuries of expansion had, over 2,000 years, become something less acute. Not gone, not resolved, but altered in character by time, the way any sustained emergency alters in character if it lasts long enough. It becomes the background condition rather than the foreground crisis. The first men who were alive at the end of the war were not the descendants of conquerors in any psychologically meaningful sense. They were simply people who had always lived in these forests, who had always fought intermittently with beings they rarely saw clearly, who had grown up with the Weirwood trees as ambient features of the landscape, rather than as specific objects of conflict. The war had become for them too the weather. The pact was made on the Isle of Faces. Both sides came to it with what remained of their energy and their willingness to imagine something other than the conflict they had always known. The first men sent representatives, the children sent singers, and whether the singers also sent their Greenseers into the Weirwood trees to observe and participate through the network is something the histories do not specify, but that seems, given what we know about how the children operated, essentially certain. The terms were geographic, the open lands for the first men, the deep forests and sacred groves for the children, the weirwoods to be respected wherever they grew. Both sides swore their oaths before the carved faces of the island's trees. And the war, after 2,000 years, ended. Jon Snow knows nothing of the pact. This is worth saying plainly. When he rides north of the wall on his ranging and feels the deep cold of the forest beyond, as something different in kind from ordinary cold, heavier, older, inhabited in a way that is not about the wildlings or the other creatures he has been warned about, but about something prior to all of them. He is feeling the residue of this. The oldest layer of Westeros's history, laid down before any human record, and persisting beneath all human records, the way bedrock persists beneath every layer that accumulates above it. He does not have the language for what he is feeling. He does not need it. The forest speaks below the level of language. Your watch is ended for this passage. Let the long war recede now. Let it sink back into the deep past where it has always been. The conflict is over. The agreement was made. 4,000 years of peace lay ahead of both peoples, the longest sustained peace in the history of this world. That peace had a cost that neither side fully understood at the time of the making. But tonight that cost can wait. For now, the forest is still. The carved faces observe the dark. The roots continue their slow work. And you are resting, as you should be, in the quiet between one age and the next. There is something in the geography of the Long War that is rarely commented on. And it is this. The Weirwood trees were the battlefield and the record simultaneously. Every grove that the first men cleared, and every grove that the children defended, was both a military objective and a node in the network through which the children observed what was happening to them. The Greenseers watched the war from within the war's most critical infrastructure. They felt every cut tree as a severing of their own awareness. They experienced every burned grove not only as a loss of sacred space, but as a specific darkening of the network, a silencing of the voices that those trees had carried, a closing of windows through which they had been seeing the world for thousands of years. The war was, for the children, a war against their own senses, as much as a war against a physical enemy. Each advance by the first men was simultaneously a diminishment of the children's ability to understand what was happening to them, which may be the cruelest aspect of the entire conflict. The first men who eventually came to worship the old gods, who made peace with the Weirwood trees, and knelt before the carved faces, and adopted the children's religion in the imperfect, partial, culturally translated form that would persist into the age we know, were not doing something sentimental or symbolic when they made that choice. They were making a practical decision of enormous consequence. The Weirwood trees in the Godswoods of the North are not simply religious objects. They are surviving nodes of a network that in diminished form still functions. The first men who chose to protect those trees chose, without knowing it, to preserve the infrastructure of a civilization. The Northern Lords who maintained their Godswoods across the 8,000 years between the Pact and the events of the main story were not preserving tradition in the sense that humans usually preserve tradition, out of habit or sentiment or conservatism. They were maintaining a living system. The trees needed tending. The trees received tending. And the trees in return continued to carry what they had always carried. If this story is finding you in the dark, consider subscribing so the next one is waiting when you return. Every story I tell is a slow one, and there is always another waiting. The pact was real. The peace was real. 4,000 years of it, the longest the world has ever known. But it was made in the shadow of a secret that the children carried alone, something they could not confess to the people they were making peace with, something they had done in the darkest hour before the agreement. And that secret had not gone anywhere. It was only waiting. The God's Eye is the largest lake in Westeros, a body of water so vast that sailors crossing it from north to south cannot see either shore for the middle portion of their journey. And the water in its deepest sections is dark enough that its bottom has never been conclusively sounded. It sits in the heart of what is now called the riverlands, fed by rivers that carry the runoff of half a continent. And in the early morning and late evening, a mist rises from its surface that can last for hours, reducing visibility to the length of an outstretched arm. In the center of the god's eye, emerging from that mist as though placed there by a hand that understood the importance of centers, of the point equidistant from all the contested edges of a conflict, there is an island, and every tree on that island is a weirwood. Let your breathing stay slow and easy. You are moving now through the quietest part of the children's story, the long peace that followed the long war. The 4,000 years in which two peoples shared a world and did not try to destroy each other. This is not a simple peace. It is not the peace of perfect understanding or genuine reconciliation, or the resolution of all the injuries that 2,000 years of conflict had accumulated. It is the peace of mutual recognition, the recognition that the alternative is worse, and that is a more honest basis for peace than most agreements ever achieve. The Isle of Faces awaits. The agreement is about to be made. Let yourself drift toward it across the dark water. The meeting that produced the pact is not well documented. This is not surprising. Neither the children of the forest nor the first men of this era had historiography in the academic sense. The systematic recording of events with sources and dates, and the attempt at objectivity that later scholars would develop. What the children had was the Weirwood network, which recorded everything the trees observed across the entire continent. What the first men had was oral tradition, stories passed through generations, inevitably shaped by each retelling, inevitably carrying the interests and emphases of the community doing the telling. The account of the pact that survived into the Maester's records is a human account of a human interpretation of something that was much stranger than the record suggests. But its essential terms are real. The agreement was real. The oaths were real. And the island where they were sworn is real still. The terms that can be reconstructed from surviving sources are geographic at their core. The open lands, the coasts, the plains, the river valleys, the territories where first men's settlements had already taken root and grown across multiple generations, these would belong to the first men and their descendants. The deep forests, the sacred islands of Weirwood, the ancient groves wherever they still stood, these would be inviolable, the territory and the spiritual property of the children of the forest, protected under the terms of the agreement from any further cutting or burning or diminishment. And wherever a weirwood tree still grew in first men-held territory, it was to be left standing. Not because the first men worshipped those trees at the time of the agreement. That came later, through the slow adoption that proximity and coexistence made possible, but because the children required it as the central condition of any peace at all. The green men are the figures who emerge from the pact most obscurely, most intriguingly, most resistant to the categorizing impulse that human historiography brings to everything it touches. The agreement required guardians for the Isle of Faces, beings who would maintain the sanctity of the treaty site and the integrity of the Weirwood Grove at its center across generations that would become centuries and centuries that would become millennia. The green men are those guardians. They are described in the oldest surviving accounts as wearing antlered helms and cloaks of living leaves, as having skin that tends toward green in the way that the children's skin tended toward brown and grey, as being neither entirely human nor entirely children. but something that the peace itself had produced, a new category that neither party to the agreement had anticipated or planned. Whether any green men still maintain their vigil on the island today is a question that the records cannot answer, because the Isle of Faces is the kind of place that discourages record-keeping. We should pause here and sit with the concept of a treaty maintained across 4,000 years. In human political history, this is without precedent. Alliances last decades, peace agreements a century or two if they are backed by sufficient military deterrent or sufficient shared interest. 4 millennia is not a political achievement in the ordinary sense. It is something closer to a geological one. What sustained it was not force. Neither side was in a position to enforce the agreement militarily for the entirety of that period, and not even shared interest in the conventional sense, since the children and the first men had fundamentally incompatible interests for much of the peace's duration. What sustained it was something more like the mutual recognition that the conflict they had ended was the worst thing that had ever happened to either of them, and that any short-term advantage that might be gained from breaking the agreement was not worth repeating the cost of the war. The adoption of the old gods by the first men is the most significant cultural process of the Pact period, and it happened without any deliberate effort by either party to produce it. The first men who lived closest to the remaining children, who built their settlements in the proximity of still-standing Weirwood groves, who encountered the children not as enemies in the deep wood, but as cautious presences at the edges of their daily lives. These people began, across generations, to feel something in the carved faces of the Weirwoods that they had not felt before the Pact. Not the children's full understanding of what those trees were, and what the network carried between them, but a shadow of that understanding, a residue of the tens of thousands of years of prayer and attention, and accumulated reverence that the children had directed at those trees, which had accumulated in the trees themselves the way water accumulates in stone, slowly, invisibly, until the stone is saturated. They began to kneel before the Weirwoods. They began to bring small offerings. They began to pray, not in the way their own culture had prayed, not in the way that involves words directed outward toward a deity conceived as separate from the world, but in the way the children prayed, with attention directed inward and downward, into the roots, into the network, into the vast accumulated silence of everything the trees had witnessed. This it is how the old gods became the old gods, not through theology or doctrine or the intervention of divine beings. Through proximity and imitation and the slow recognition, imperfect, partial, never fully articulated, that something in those trees warranted exactly this: the quiet, the kneeling, the wordless offering of presence. The old gods have no names. This is the most important and most revealing fact about them. Every other religion in Westeros, the faith of the Seven with its elaborate pantheon, R'hllor with his demands and his prophecies, the drowned god of the Iron Islands with his particular mythology of death and rebirth, has named gods with personalities, stories, relationships, and demands. The old gods have only silence and presence, and the faint quality of attention that people feel when they stand before a carved Weirwood face, and cannot quite shake the sense that the face is looking back. This silence is the children's inheritance, passed to the first men not as a doctrine, but as a practice, and preserved across 8,000 years of human history without ever being rationalized into theology, because the silence itself resists rationalization. You cannot explain what you feel in a god's wood. You can only feel it. The Isle of Faces remains, 4,000 years after the Pact and 8,000 years after the Long Night, and 12,000 years after the children first sang to the trees in a forest that covered the entire continent. The Weirwood Grove at its centre has been growing since before any humans stood on this earth, and its oldest trees have bark so pale it seems to generate its own light in the fog. The faces carved into those trees, the faces that watched the pact being made and have been watching ever since, wear expressions that visitors find difficult to characterize, because they seem to change when you are not looking directly at them. Something between grief and patience. Something between knowing and waiting. The expressions of beings who have seen the whole story, who know how it ends, and who have decided that watching is the only response adequate to that knowledge. When Catelyn Stark lights a candle before the image of the seven-faced god in her private devotion at Riverrun, she is practicing a religion that arrived in Westeros with the Andal invasion and displaced the old gods in the south with the efficiency of a people who bring iron and the certainty of their faith together at the same moment. When Ned Stark kneels in the Godswood at Winterfell, in the early morning with no words and no ceremony, and nothing but his presence and his patience, he is practicing the religion that preceded the Andal's arrival by 4,000 years. Both are sincere. Both represent genuine connection to something real. But only one of them goes back to the pact. Only one of them connects its practitioner, however thinly, however many thousands of years removed, to the two peoples who stood on the Isle of Faces and agreed to share a world. When Sansa Stark, in the Godswood of the Red Keep, a weirwood tree transplanted far from its natural range, in a city where the old gods are practiced only by the people of the north who come to court, when she kneels before that tree and asks it for things she cannot ask anyone else, she is doing something her captors in King's Landing do not understand and would not honor if they did. She is not performing ritual. She is reaching for a thread that connects her, through her blood and her family's history, and the long chain of all the Starks who knelt before Weirwoods before her, to the children of the forest. The thread is thin, the distance is enormous, but the connection is real. And in the quiet that follows her prayers, something in the pale bark of that southern weirwood listens. Rest now. Let the pact settle around you like the mist on the god's eye, not obscuring, just softening, just making the edges of things a little less sharp than they were before. The peace was made. It held. For 4,000 years, two peoples shared a world in a way that most peoples never manage for 4 generations. That is something. It is worth knowing before you sleep. Your watch is ended. The water is still. The faces on the island are watching, as they have always watched, in the specific silence of things that have seen too much to feel the need to speak. The most terrible thing about the Night King is not that he existed. It is who made him, and why, and what it tells us about the lengths to which any people will go when they believe they are standing at the absolute edge of their own extinction. There is a moment in the history of the children of the forest that no account dwells on for long, that scholars have tried to date and contextualize and explain, and that resists all 3 of these operations with the patience of something that knows it cannot be made comfortable. It is not a moment of heroism or of moral elevation, or of the kind of inspired decision-making that histories prefer to record when they are at their most flattering. It is the moment when a people who had spent 10,000 years tending life, caring for the forest, maintaining the balance, practicing a magic that was fundamentally organized around growth and continuation and the slow permanence of things that live in cycles, made the decision to create a weapon. Not a weapon in the ordinary sense. A weapon that would eventually become the greatest threat to all life in the world. let your breathing remain slow and even. This part of the story carries weight, not the weight of spectacle or of drama that insists on your attention, but the specific weight of irony. The weight of watching something terrible happen that was done with entirely understandable intention. The children of the forest did not want to end the world. They wanted to survive in it. And the distinction between those two desires under sufficient pressure, under the kind of pressure that comes from fighting a 2,000-year war, while simultaneously watching a supernatural darkness descend on what remains of your world from the north, becomes much thinner than you would prefer it to be. Let yourself receive this part of the story gently. It does not require your horror, only your attention. The long night preceded the Night King in the timeline, and this sequence matters. The long night was a winter of unprecedented length, a winter that lasted a generation, during which the sun barely rose, and when it did, gave so little warmth that crops failed across the continent for year after unrelenting year. People starved. Livestock died. The carefully maintained balance of the children's forests, the delicate reciprocal system they had tended across 10,000 years, began to fail in ways that the Greenseers watched helplessly through the Weirwood network, feeling each collapse as though it were a nerve ending going dark. We do not know what caused the long night. The maesters have theories. The legends have explanations. The Weirwood network holds the answer, locked in the deep memory of the trees, and Bran Stark will one day access it. But what we know, and what is enough for tonight, is that it happened, that it was real, that it was killing everything. And within the long night, something moved, something emerged from the permanent cold of the uttermost north, from the lands of always winter, which the children's Greenseers had always observed with a cautious periphery of attention, because even 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge had not fully mapped what lived there. It moved south through the darkness with a quality that the Greenseers in the Weirwood network felt before they fully understood what they were feeling. Intelligence, purpose, the specific, chilling quality of intent that distinguishes a directed force from a natural one. It built as it moved. It collected. The dead that the long night produced, and in that generation-long winter, the dead were everywhere, rose for it, joined its southward movement, grew its numbers in a way that had no precedent in anything the children's memory contained. They were facing something new, something that had not existed in the 10,000 years of their recorded history. The children of the forest made a weapon. This is the fact stated as plainly as it can be stated, because the circumstances around it have been obscured for so long, by the passage of time, by the deliberate silence of the children themselves, by the human tendency to attribute the origins of the worst things to the worst people, that the clarity is more important here than the nuance. The children drove a shard of dragonglass into the chest of a living man, directly through the heart, and the magic they had practiced for 10,000 years, in the service of life turned, in that single deliberate act, towards something that life had never previously produced. The man's eyes went from their natural color to the blue of deep ice. And the Night King was born, the first of the White Walkers. The commander who would eventually become the existential threat from which neither the children nor the first men could hide. We should sit with the desperation that produced this, not with the horror, though the horror is real and should not be minimized, but with the circumstances that made a 10,000-year civilization of nature tenders resort to the creation of a death weapon. The children were fighting a 2,000-year war against people who outnumbered them and were systematically destroying the world that sustained their existence. And on top of that war, on top of the burning forests and the severed Weirwood network and the steady contraction of their territory, there was now a supernatural winter that was killing the land itself. And within the winter, something moving south with the dead. They had no choices they recognized as adequate. They had only the tools they had, and the deepest and most powerful tool they possessed was their magic, which was the magic of transformation, of taking one thing and making it into another. They tried to take a man and make him into a force capable of standing against what was coming. They told themselves, or they believed, or they were desperate enough to pretend that they would be able to control it. The critical error was not in the creation itself. It was in the assumption that a thing created to serve a purpose would continue to serve that purpose. The children understood the living world with a depth that no human civilization has ever matched. They understood the patterns of growth and decay, of birth and transformation, of the way that systems maintained themselves across centuries. What they did not adequately account for, what no one perhaps could have adequately accounted for without prior evidence, was what happens when you take a human consciousness and subject it to a transformation as total as the one they performed. The Night King was not a weapon that happened to have once been a man. He was a man who had become something new. And what was new in him was not controllable in the way that a blade or a siege weapon is controllable. He had his own will, his own intelligence, his own memory of what had been done to him and by whom. The long night deepened. The cold pressed south. The Night King's army grew with every death the darkness produced, a capacity that the children had not anticipated and could not counter with any of the tools they had brought to the task of his creation. The weapon was working. It was stopping nothing. It was instead becoming the second catastrophe on top of the first. And the Greenseers in the Weirwood network watched this and understood something that must have been among the most devastating recognitions in the history of a people who had seen a great deal of devastating things. The monster they had made to save them was now larger than the problem they had made it to address, and there was nothing in their entire history that told them how to uncreate what they had created. The alliance that ended the long night is the most extraordinary diplomatic achievement in the history of Westeros. Not because it was diplomatically sophisticated, it probably was not. Not because it was built on genuine understanding or the resolution of all the injuries that 2,000 years of prior conflict had produced. It was not that either. But because it required the children of the forest to ask for help from the people they had been fighting for 2,000 years. And it required those same people, the first men who had spent 2,000 years burning the children's forests and cutting the children's sacred trees and driving the children's people from their ancestral territories, to stand alongside those same beings and fight something that threatened to kill everything that remained on both sides of the old conflict. In the long night, two peoples who had nearly destroyed each other in a sustained effort of mutual violence found each other as the only allies either one had left. And they fought together. And they survived. The hero or heroes who drove the Night King north, who pushed his army back beyond the point where the wall would one day stand, are remembered in human legend under many names and in many forms. Azor Ahai, the last hero, the figure who carried the sword of fire into the darkness. These legends are human legends, shaped by human priorities, giving human form to events in which the children's contribution was at least as significant as any individual warrior's deed. The children fought. They used their magic in the specific expensive ways that their deep knowledge of the world made available to them. Ways that cost them significantly in the number of their Greenseers and in the integrity of the Weirwood network at its northern edges. They paid for what they had made. Not in full, no payment could have been full, given the scale of what the Night King became, but they paid. And then, when the long night ended and the wall went up, they retreated north of it along with the surviving children, and they kept their silence. When Jon Snow stands at Hardhome and watches the Night King raise his hand, and the dead rise from the beach below, what he is witnessing is the continuation of an act performed 10,000 years before he was born, by beings he has never met, for reasons that would take the rest of his life to fully understand. The Night King does not forget. Whatever the original man's consciousness contained, whatever memories and capacities and will the transformation preserved inside the shell of what he became, it persists. It has been persisting for 10,000 years, patient in the permanent cold of the lands of always winter, waiting for the wall to come down. Not because someone is planning to bring it down, because everything that can be waited out, given sufficient time, eventually is. The Stark words carry this history without knowing they carry it. Winter is coming is not a philosophy or a piece of northern stoicism, or a warning about the weather in the ordinary sense. It is the specific memory of a generation-long winter that killed almost everyone, encoded in a family motto and passed forward through every generation of Starks since the long night ended. Each generation less certain than the previous one of exactly what the warning means, but none of them willing to abandon it, because something in the blood knows, even when the mind has forgotten. When Ned Stark says those words, he is speaking from inside a tradition whose full meaning he has lost. When Bran Stark begins to dream, he starts the process of recovering it. Rest now. The Night King is far away. He has always been far away, contained imperfectly behind the wall, in the long cold darkness where the children's most terrible mistake has been waiting. You are warm. The darkness around you is the ordinary dark of a room, of a bed, of a night that will have a morning. The long night is over. The long night has been over for 10,000 years. Let whatever tenseness the story has created in your shoulders or your jaw release now, slowly, completely. Your watch is ended. The fire is low. The forest is still. Sleep. The Night King was the children's mistake. But the Weirwood network is their gift. And the gift is, in its own way, as extraordinary as the mistake was catastrophic. Because what the children built in those trees is not simply memory. It is the possibility, for anyone who can access it, of knowing the truth of the world in a way that no human institution has ever made available. The Weirwood network is not a metaphor. This is the first thing to understand about it, and the hardest thing to hold, because the human mind has been trained, in Westeros as in every other world, to interpret the sacred as metaphorical, to treat religious practice as a symbolic activity that points toward meanings which exist elsewhere, in some non-physical realm that the physical practice merely gestures at. The Weirwood trees are not like that. The network they form is not symbolic, it is structural. It is a biological and magical mechanism that functions in the world with the same factual solidity as a river or a mountain range or a winter that lasts a generation. The memory it carries is real memory. The awareness it embodies is real awareness. The eyes of the Greenseer looking out from the carved faces of the Weirwood trees are real eyes, however different in their nature from the eyes in any living face. Let your breathing slow. You are very deep in rest now, deep in the quiet where only the oldest things are fully audible. The Weirwood network is one of those things. Not the loudest presence in the world, quite the opposite. It is the quietest, the most patient, the one most willing to wait in silence for the moment when someone arrives with the right kind of attention to hear it. You have that kind of attention tonight. Let yourself be still enough to feel what it might be like to be part of a web of listening that stretches across an entire continent and goes back 12,000 years. Not frightening, not overwhelming, simply present the way the oldest things are present, without urgency, without demand, simply there. The mechanism of the network involves the physical connection of the Weirwood root systems across vast distances beneath the surface of the earth. Weirwood roots are not like the roots of other trees, which spread horizontally through the topsoil to capture water and nutrients from a localized area. Weirwood roots go down, and they go far, and they connect, and the connection carries something that neither biology nor the magical theory of Westeros's masters has ever fully characterized. Call it information for the purposes of tonight. Call it the transfer of what has been witnessed, of the record of every event that occurred in the range of a Weirwood's senses, which includes not just visual perception, but something closer to the total sensory and emotional atmosphere of a place across time. The trees remember not just what happened, but what it felt like. Not just the event, but its texture, its weather, its particular quality of light and sound, and the way the people involved carried themselves in the moments before and after. The Greenseers' role in this network is not passive reception. A Greenseer does not simply sit before a Weirwood tree and receive transmissions the way a person might sit before a fire and receive its warmth. A Greenseer enters the network. Their consciousness becomes, for the duration of their immersion, another node, another point of awareness distributed through the web, capable of moving through it, of directing attention across thousands of miles and thousands of years with something that is not quite intention, in the usual sense, but is closer to it than any word in the human vocabulary captures. The experience of green-seeing, as Bran Stark discovers, is not like watching a vision from the outside. It is like being present in a moment that is simultaneously past and present and, in some cases, that the Meisters would prefer not to acknowledge, also future. The Ravens are part of the network. This is perhaps the least understood aspect of the children's legacy, and it is everywhere in Westeros for anyone who knows how to look. Ravens are not simply messengers in the way that human postal systems use messengers, though they serve that function too in the Maester's system, because the Maesters who work with ravens are themselves, unknowingly, working within a tradition that the children established. Ravens have an unusual relationship to the Weirwood network. They can be directed through it. Their sight can be borrowed. Their travel can be influenced by the same currents of awareness that the Greenseers move through when they enter the network. The three-eyed crow that visits Bran Stark's dreams is not a hallucination, and is not a simple metaphor. It is a raven acting as an emissary of the network itself, guided by the last Greenseer who has access to the full system, carrying a summons from the far north. Bloodraven, Brynden Rivers, the bastard son of Aegon the Unworthy, one-eyed and white-haired, and described in human history as a spy master of exceptional ruthlessness, became the three-eyed raven. This is perhaps the most remarkable individual story in the history of the children's legacy. A human being, born into the politics of the Targaryen court, who served as a spy master and was said to have eyes and ears everywhere, who seemed to know things he could not possibly know through ordinary means. This is the human history. The other history, the one that Bran's journey reveals, is that Bloodraven had the gift of green sight to a degree unusual, even by the standards of the families that carried it, and that he followed the thread of that gift north, when his human life was over, and that in the cave beyond the wall, he found the last children and became something that the word human no longer fully covered. The weight of all memory is not abstract when you are the one carrying it. This is the thing that no account of the Weirwood network ever dwells on adequately. What it costs the Greenseer to hold what the network holds. Bran Stark discovers this not gradually, but with a kind of violence. The visions overwhelm him, press in on him with a quality of urgency that feels like drowning, demand his attention in moments when he has not chosen to give it. The children designed the network to carry memory across time, but they did not design it with human minds in mind. And human minds encounter the full weight of 10,000 years of accumulated observation with a quality of shock that requires time and guidance, and the presence of a teacher who has already made it through the shock and found the still place on the other side. Bloodraven is that teacher. The cave is that place. The three-eyed raven is a terrible thing to become. This is something that the story implies, but rarely states directly. Bloodraven did not choose a peaceful retirement. He chose to be slowly consumed by the network, to allow the Weirwood roots to grow around him and into him, to give up the sharp edges of individual experience in exchange for access to the entire distributed awareness of the system. He still remembers being Brynden Rivers. He still has preferences and judgments and the capacity for care, as his relationship with Bran demonstrates. But he is no longer fully individual in the way he was. He has become something that the word person only partially fits, a presence in the network that has its own character, but is no longer entirely separable from the network itself. When he tells Bran that he has been watching him for a long time, this is not a figure of speech. The eyes in the Weirwood faces of every Godswood in the north have been watching Bran since the night of his birth. What the network knows about the current crisis, about the Night King and the army of the dead, and the approaching end of the Long Night's temporary resolution, is everything. The trees were watching when the Night King was made. They were watching when the wall went up. They have been watching the slow accumulation of the dead beyond the wall for 8,000 years, each ranging party that did not return adding to the count. They know what is coming with a specificity that no human intelligence network could match, because they have been present at every relevant event and have forgotten nothing. The burden of the three-eyed raven is not the knowing. It is the waiting for the one person who has the right combination of gifts and preparation, and sheer stubborn survival to receive what needs to be received and carry it south. When Bran Stark arrives at the cave, carried there by Meera Reed across a landscape that should have killed them both, with Hodor's sacrifice still warm and terrible, and so recent that Bran has not yet had the space to feel its full weight. He is arriving at the end of the longest patient vigil in the history of Westeros. The cave is the last point in the Weirwood network that is still fully operational. The children who remain there, Leaf and the others, small and ancient and carrying in their large gold-green eyes the awareness of everything they have outlasted, are the last of their kind in the world. The world above them is still burning. The Night King is coming. And the thing they have been waiting for, across all the centuries since the Pact and the Long Night, and the slow retreat that followed both, has finally arrived. A mind capable of receiving the memory. Samwell Tarly, in the Citadel in Old Town, discovering the history of the Children of the Forest in books that the Maesters have filed under mythology, is touching the same thing that Bran is touching in the cave, but from the outside. Sam reads about dragonglass and takes it seriously. Sam reads about the Long Night and does not dismiss it as legend. He's doing the work that the Weirwood network has been waiting for someone to do for 8,000 years, taking the past seriously enough to use it. This is also the children's inheritance, not only in the bloodlines of Greenseers, but in the specific impulse present in certain people in every generation to treat ancient knowledge as knowledge rather than as mythology. The network has been trying to pass its information south for thousands of years. The information has finally found people capable of hearing it. Rest now. The network is around you. Not as something demanding your participation, not as something that requires your attention or your effort or your understanding, simply as a presence. The way the deepest things are always present, quietly, without fanfare, patient as roots, available to anyone willing to be still enough to feel them. The Weirwood faces are watching, the ravens are moving through the dark, and in the cave beyond the wall, the last keeper of everything the children have ever known waits with the patience of someone who has learned, across 3 centuries of vigil, that time itself is not an obstacle. Your watch is ended. Sleep. The ravens that Maesters use to carry messages across Westeros are not, in their deepest nature, message carriers. They are the last visible expression of the children's most sophisticated technology. The Citadel trained its ravens through a system it inherited and has never fully understood. A system in which the birds demonstrate an unusual receptivity to specific destinations, an unusual memory for specific faces, an unusual capacity to navigate not simply by landmark or magnetic field, but by something that the Maesters have catalogued as instinct. And that is, in fact, the residual influence of the Weirwood network on creatures that have been living in proximity to Weirwood trees for as long as the children's civilization existed. The ravens are part of the network. They have always been part of the network. When a raven arrives with a message at precisely the moment it is most needed, when it finds its target in conditions that ought to have made navigation impossible, it is not demonstrating an unusual degree of bird intelligence. It is demonstrating that the network through which it moves is still, in some attenuated but functional form, operational. The weight of knowing everything is not a gift that the Greenseers have described in favourable terms. In the accounts that survive of what Greensight feels like from the inside, accounts necessarily filtered through human language and human frameworks, and therefore inevitably imprecise, the recurring quality is not wonder, but pressure. The weight of accumulated observation is not neutral. It comes with all of the emotional content of the moments it recorded, grief and terror and the specific quality of exhaustion that comes from watching the same mistakes repeated across millennia without being able to intervene. Bloodraven, in the cave, has been living with 10,000 years of that pressure for the entirety of his 3 centuries in the network. When he finally passes everything to Bran, what he passes is not simply information. It is the experience of having held that information for as long as he held it. And the complex relief of finding someone else who is, at last, capable of bearing it. If this story is finding you in the dark, consider subscribing so the next one is waiting when you return. Every story I tell is a slow one, and there is always another waiting. The children of the forest survived the first men. They survived the long night. They endured 2,000 years of war and 4,000 years of cautious peace. But they could not survive what came next. And what came next arrived not from beyond the sea, not from the uttermost north, but from within the very world that the pact had made for them. The Andals came from Essos approximately 6,000 years before the Targaryen conquest, which places their arrival roughly 4,000 years after the pact between the children and the first men. They came with iron. This is the detail that the histories always emphasize, and it deserves emphasis because iron changed the equation in a way that bronze never had. Bronze is a sophisticated material that requires skill and specific resources to produce, and its production placed natural constraints on how quickly any bronze-using culture could expand. Iron is different. Iron ore is everywhere. The technology for smelting it, once learned, is more widely reproducible, more accessible to smaller communities and individual craftspeople, more easily adapted to the specific tools of conquest and clearing. The Andals arrived with iron weapons and iron axes, and an iron faith in a seven-faced god who demanded the burning of the Weirwood trees. Let your breathing be slow. You are very deep in rest now. And what is coming in this part of the story is not something you need to brace against. It is simply the next chapter in a very long story, the next wave in a sequence of waves that the children of the forest were not, in the end, able to outlast. There is grief in it. There is the specific grief of watching something ancient come to its end, not through cataclysm, but through the slow accumulation of individual decisions, each one small, each one entirely comprehensible in human terms, together adding up to the irreversible. Let yourself receive it without rushing toward resolution. The resolution comes later. Tonight, there is time to feel the weight of the going first. The faith of the Seven arrived with the Andals as an integral part of their identity, not as a separate cultural element that could be adopted or rejected independently of the conquest itself. To be Andal was to follow the Seven. To follow the Seven was to understand the Weirwood trees not as sacred, not as something warranting the careful respect that even the most conquest-minded first men had come to show them after 4,000 years of the pact, but as objects of superstition to be destroyed. The Andals burned the Weirwood groves in the south systematically. Not every tree everywhere at once, but grove by grove, season by season, as the conquest progressed. They were not operating from malice toward the children specifically. The children were, by this point, so diminished and so reclusive in most of the south that the Andals probably encountered them rarely, if at all. They were burning the trees because their faith told them to, because the carved faces were idols, and idols were abominations. Iron cuts Weirwood. Bronze can cut Weirwood slowly at great effort. Iron cuts it efficiently, at speed, with the particular ease that makes industrial-scale deforestation possible for the first time in Westeros's history. And iron has another property that the children discovered at terrible cost. It interferes with their magic in ways that stone and bronze do not. The deeper mechanisms of this interference are not fully understood even by the maesters who have studied it. The relationship between iron and magic in this world is one of those foundational puzzles that the Citadel has never conclusively resolved. But the phenomenological reality is plain in the historical record. The children's magic, which had sustained them through 10,000 years, and a 2,000-year war and the Long Night itself was significantly less effective against an iron-wielding enemy than it had been against a bronze-wielding one. The forest's defences failed. The network's southern reaches were severed as the trees that sustained them fell. The first men who had converted to the faith of the Seven joined the Andal expansion or made way for it. The first men who kept the old gods, who maintained their relationship with the Weirwood trees and the silent practice of northern worship that the Pact had produced, retreated north along with whatever remaining children could be found. This is the point at which the religious geography of Westeros was set. The south became Andal territory, faith of the Seven territory, the territory of a civilization that oriented itself toward its gods through cathedrals and doctrines and the organized power of an institution. The north retained the old gods, retained the Weirwoods, retained the practice of silent worship in Godswoods, retained, in other words, everything that connected it, however thinly, to the original world of the Children of the Forest. The children fled north. This is the simplest and most accurate summary of the Andal period from the children's perspective, and it takes only 11 words to say what it took 4,000 years to accomplish. They had retreated before, during the worst centuries of the war with the First Men. They had given up the south and the coasts and the river valleys and concentrated in the deep forests of the north. Now they retreated further, past the neck, past the gift, past the wall itself, into the cold forests beyond the wall where the Andals did not go, where the first men who kept the old gods maintained enough of the old relationship that the surviving children could find tolerable proximity without the constant threat of burning and iron. The north of Westeros became, in the post-Andal period, the last sanctuary of everything the children had been. But north of the wall, in the forests of the far north that the children now shared with the wildling descendants of first men who had never come south, something was also waiting. The Night King's army continued its slow accumulation in the lands of always winter. The wall held, the Night's Watch maintained its vigil, generation after generation. The original reasons for its existence becoming less clear as centuries passed, and the supernatural threat seemed to recede into the category of legend. And the children, in the forests north of the wall, continued their diminishment, not through conquest now, not through burning, but through the simple arithmetic of a people whose numbers had been reduced too far to sustain themselves across the long term. They had too few Greenseers, too few singers. The Weirwood network, deprived of its southern nodes, was carrying less than it had been designed to carry, a reduced system still functioning but operating below its capacity. The last children lived in specific locations, not scattered through the forest as they had once been, but concentrated in the few places that the Weirwood network still fully supported. The cave beneath the great Weirwood tree beyond the wall became their most significant remaining site, the place where the network's connection to the deep roots was strongest, where the Greenseers' art could still be practiced at full depth, where the memory the trees carried was most accessible. It was, by the time Bloodraven arrived there, something between a library and a refuge and a last redoubt. The children who remained there knew what they were. They knew they were the end of something, and they had decided, in the way that the oldest things decide things, without drama, without ceremony, with only a long patience, that what they could still do was pass what they knew to whoever came with the right eyes to receive it. The Andal invasion had effects on the Weirwood network that persisted long after the invasion itself was over. Each tree that was cut severed a connection. Each grove that was burned silenced a segment of the accumulated memory. The network did not collapse. It is still functioning in the time of the events we know, still accessible to anyone with the gift and the training to access it, but it is a diminished version of what it was. The Greenseers who move through it today move through a system where many of the nodes are dark, where the memory of entire regions of southern Westeros is simply absent, burned away with the trees that carried it. There are events that occurred in the south of Westeros during the height of the children's time there that are now permanently beyond recovery, because the trees that witnessed them were cut, and the memory they held was destroyed with them. What the Andals burned was not simply wood, it was knowledge. It was the irreplaceable record of the world. Daenerys Targaryen does not know any of this when she stands at Dragonstone and looks out at the sea. She knows dragons. She knows conquest and survival and the particular loneliness of being the last of something. But she does not know that the island she stands on is itself a place with a deep relationship to fire, to the same elemental forces that the children balanced against the deep green magic of the network for 10,000 years. She does not know that the ancestors of her dragons came from a world where fire and the living network had been in a relationship of careful opposition for longer than human memory reaches. She is, in her own way, another inheritor of a history she does not have access to, another person walking on the surface of a depth she cannot see. The children would have recognized her if any remained. They would have recognized what she carried without being able to name it in any language she spoke. The North remembers. This is a phrase that the Northerners use and the Southerners mock, and both sides have approximately equal claim to being right. The North does remember, not accurately, not completely, not with anything like the fidelity of the Weirwood network's actual record. But it remembers something. It remembers the shape of what the Andals cost. It remembers, in the practice of the old gods, and in the maintenance of the gods' woods, and in the deep cultural suspicion of southern sophistication and southern religion, a time when the world was organized differently. When the forest covered the continent and the trees could speak to each other across thousands of miles, and the oldest knowledge was not in any book, but in the living roots of things that had been alive since before any human had learned to write. The Starks remember this without knowing that they remember it. The memory is in their bones, not their minds. The Andal invasion's effect on the surviving children is one of those historical processes that is almost impossible to reconstruct from the outside because it left so few traces in the record, and the traces it left were recorded by the Andals themselves, who had neither the context nor the inclination to document accurately what was happening to the people their advance displaced. The occasional reference in the oldest Andal chronicles to forest spirits or green demons or the servants of the old trees represents almost certainly encounters with the children of the forest as the Andal expansion pressed north. These accounts describe the children as dangerous, as magical, as associated with the Weirwood trees that the faith required to be burned. They do not describe them as a civilization. They do not describe them as a people with 10,000 years of continuous history behind them. The Andals were not equipped, intellectually or culturally, to see what they were looking at, and the record they produced reflects that limitation. There is a particular kind of loss that occurs when a place loses the people who knew it best. the southern forests of Westeros, the forests that once covered the Reach and the Riverlands and the Crownlands, now reduced to managed woodlands and isolated stands of old growth, no longer carry what they once carried. Not because the trees are gone entirely, but because the connection between the trees and the people who understood that connection has been severed. The Weirwoods in the south have been gone for 6,000 years, burned by the Andals in a process so thorough that there are no survivors of those southern groves anywhere in the historical record. The first men who might have maintained the relationship between the human world and the living network chose, when forced to choose, between their faith in the old gods and their survival in the new political reality. Most of them chose survival. The trees were left without anyone to tend them. And without tending, without the reciprocal exchange of attention and care that the children had practiced for 10,000 years, the southern groves died, and the network lost the voices they had carried. And a silence settled over the south that has lasted 6,000 years and shows no sign of ending. Your watch is ended for this passage. The Andals are long dead, the last of them indistinguishable from the first men they conquered. Their distinct identity dissolved into the general population of the south across 6,000 years of coexistence. The Weirwood groves they burned are gone. The children they drove north are nearly gone, but not entirely, not yet. In the cave beyond the wall, in the permanent cold of the far north, something remains. Something waits. And the story of what it waits for is not yet finished. Rest now. The forest is still. The night is deep and ordinary. Your breathing is slow and the darkness around you is gentle. Sleep. At the end of every long withdrawal, there is a cave. This is perhaps the oldest truth about what survives when everything else is taken. At the end of all the children's retreats, from the south, from the riverlands, from the forests below the wall, there is a cave. And in that cave, everything they were is waiting. Waiting for the one person in all the world who has the right kind of eyes. Brynden Rivers was not, by any standard measure, a person destined for sanctity. He was born a bastard of the Targaryen line in a court notorious for the messy consequences of a particularly prolific king's enthusiasms. And the name the court gave to Targaryen bastards, Bloodraven, for the red birthmark that stained half his face, carried a quality of omen that he spent his life inhabiting in the most literal possible way. He served as spymaster for the crown, with a reputation for knowing things he could not have known through ordinary channels. His ravens seemed to arrive with information that no raven should have been able to carry. His eye, he lost one in a battle and replaced it with no prosthetic, simply an empty socket that he regarded as a second kind of sight, observed things at distances that eyes do not reach. He was a Greenseer who did not yet have access to the full network, and he used what access he had in service of a political system that did not know what he was. Let your breathing be slow and deep. You are entering now the part of the story that takes place in the furthest dark, not the metaphorical dark of history, not the darkness of the long night, but the physical dark of a cave in the uttermost north, beyond the wall, where the sun barely reaches in any season, and the cold is a permanent condition rather than a weather event. It is not a frightening dark. It is the dark of depth, of going down below the surface to where the oldest things are, where the roots are, where the memory lives. Let yourself descend into it gently. There is nothing there that threatens you. There is only the quiet and the roots, and what the roots hold. Bloodraven eventually joined the Night's Watch. The circumstances that brought him there are the circumstances of Targaryen court politics, and succession disputes that do not need to be untangled tonight. What matters is the destination, not the route. He went north with a party of brothers beyond the wall into the haunted forest and did not come back. Or did not come back in the way that black brothers usually mean when they do not come back. He went further north. The last children of the forest found him, or he found them. The distinction for someone with his degree of greensight is probably not as clear as it would be for an ordinary person. And what happened in that meeting was the last great deliberate act of the children of the forest in the history of the world. They brought him to the cave, not as a prisoner, not as a curiosity, but as the thing they had been waiting for. A human mind with sufficient greensight to receive the full transmission and sufficient time left. Bloodraven was already old by this point, past 100 years by the count of those who tracked his movements, to be released from the urgency that usually prevents human minds from giving themselves fully to the network. The cave was the last intact node in the Weirwood system south of the lands of Always Winter. A great weirwood tree grew above it, its roots descending through the roof of the cave in a cascade of white root fingers, touching every surface, filling the available space with the dense vegetable architecture of 10,000 years of growth. The children sat in the roots. Bloodraven was placed in the roots. And the network took him the way roots take water. Slowly, completely, without anything being lost. The last children who remained with Bloodraven in the cave are figures of extraordinary pathos in a story that is not short on pathos. Leaf, the one whose name survives into Bran's account of his time in the cave, was ancient in a way that went beyond the usual reference of that word. She had been alive for centuries. She had watched the retreat from the south. She had watched the groves burn, and the network's nodes go dark one by one across the map of Westeros, felt each severance as a specific loss, not abstract but personal, in the way that the loss of a voice in a conversation you have been having for 300 years is personal. She and the others who remained in the cave were the last practitioners of an art that had once been practiced across an entire continent, in hundreds of groves, by thousands of singers. They were the end of it. They knew they were the end of it, and they chose to spend the end of it in service of the beginning of what came after. The three-eyed raven that visited Bran Stark's dreams was not a supernatural being in the sense that the traditions of Westeros usually mean when they speak of the supernatural. It was a raven, a genuine crow, directed through the Weirwood network by Bloodraven's consciousness in the cave, guided by the same currents of awareness that the Greenseers had always used to direct the ravens that served the network. Bloodraven reached into Bran's dreams, because Bran was the person in the generation that the cave needed, the one in whom the greensight had concentrated to the degree required for the transmission to succeed. He had been watching Bran through the eyes of the Weirwood trees in Winterfell's Godswood since the boy's birth. He had seen in the network's accumulated awareness of the Stark bloodline that this particular child was the one the cave had been waiting for. Not in a mystical sense, in the most literal sense, the one with the right combination of genetic inheritance and psychological openness and, ultimately, the specific catastrophe of the fall from the tower that had broken his legs and freed his mind to go somewhere his body could not follow. Bran's journey north is one of the most extraordinary physical and psychological odysseys in the story of Westeros, and it is one of the least understood by the people who observe it from the outside. Hodor carries him. Mira Reed protects him. Jojen Reed, whose own greensight is already showing him the end of his own story, with a clarity that nothing can soften, guides him with the specific authority of someone who knows that this journey is the most important thing he will ever do. What they are all doing, without fully knowing it, is completing the last act of the pact, returning to the children of the forest. The one thing the children were never able to give themselves. A successor who could take the memory and carry it back into the human world, where it was needed. The cave is not a destination. It is a relay point. The transmission continues through Bran. The moment of Bloodraven's death, when Bran is ready, when the transmission is complete, when the three-eyed raven has given everything the network contains to the one human mind capable of holding it, is not a dramatic moment in the conventional sense. There is no final speech, no grand summation, no dying words that crystallize the meaning of everything. There is only the cave, and the roots, and the two minds that have been in conversation for a long time finally separating, the older one going dark the way a candle goes dark when there is no longer any need for it to burn, the younger one left holding everything the older one contained. It is a passing. It is the kind of passing that the children of the forest would have recognized as right. Not an ending, but a redistribution. The consciousness of the three-eyed raven thinning and spreading into the network that had held it, adding itself to the 10,000 years of memory that the roots carry, becoming part of what the next person with the right kind of eyes might someday find. Leaf and the other children died defending Bran's escape from the cave when the Night King's army arrived. They died as the last acts of a people who had already been dying for thousands of years, not in battle, not in a dramatic last stand in the traditional sense, but in the specific act of spending what remained of themselves on the thing they had decided, in their long patience, was worth the spending. They made fire. They made it as they had always made everything, with their bodies, with the magic that was the deepest expression of what they were, with the specific knowledge that what they were doing would cost them everything and was still the right thing to do. The cave collapsed. The children were gone, and Bran, carried across the frozen ground by Mira Reed, was carrying everything the children had ever been inside, a mind that was still learning what it meant to hold it. The Stark family connection to the children of the forest reaches its fullest expression in Bran. What Ned Stark practiced as religion, and Jon Snow felt as instinct, and Arya demonstrated as an uncanny ease with direwolves and the particular strangeness of Nymeria's persistence, all of it resolves in Bran into something that functions at the level of mechanism rather than inheritance. He does not feel the connection to the Weirwood trees. He is inside it. He does not sense the accumulated memory of the children's world pressing against the edges of his awareness. He has access to it. The Stark bloodline has been carrying this capacity forward across 12,000 years of accumulated intermarriage and proximity, and the careful maintenance of godswoods, and the wordless practice of a religion they did not entirely understand, carrying it forward exactly as long as was necessary for it to arrive at the one moment in the history of Westeros when it was most needed. What Bran becomes, what the story is reaching toward in his arc, is not a king in any sense the world has seen before. It is something older, a Greenseer in the full sense, integrated into the Weirwood network, holding the memory of everything the children knew, and everything the world has witnessed, present in a way that is simultaneously individual and distributed, personal and vast. When he looks at people, he sees more than they show. When he speaks, there is a quality to his words that people around him find unsettling. Not threatening, not unkind, but weighted in a way that suggests he is drawing on a context larger than the room he is sitting in, He is. He is always drawing on the cave, on the network, on 10,000 years of accumulated observation that he is still learning to navigate. He is the continuation of something that was thought to be finished. He is what the children left. Let your breathing be very slow now. The cave is quiet again. The roots are continuing their slow work in the dark. The network, diminished but not broken, persists beneath the surface of the world, carrying what it has always carried. In the patient silence of things that do not measure time the way the living do. You are resting. The story is almost complete. One more passage remains, one more movement in the long history of what the children were and what they gave. But that can wait until your breathing has slowed a little further, until the weight of the journey you have just made settles, until the cave and the roots, and the three-eyed raven's long patience have had time to become part of what you carry into sleep. Sleep now. The roots will hold, the memory will keep. What the children of the forest were, what they gave, what they lost, and what they passed forward into bloodlines that would one day stand in courts and castles and on the shores of continents they had never seen. This is not simply the prehistory of Westeros. This is the root system beneath every story that has ever been told in this world. And we have arrived now at the question that the whole night has been moving toward: what remains? A people is not simply the individuals who compose it. This is the truth that the children of the forest teach by example, more clearly than any other civilization in the history of this world, because their example is so extreme. The children are gone, or nearly gone, by the time of the events we know as the story of the Seven Kingdoms. There are no children of the forest in any court or castle in Westeros. There are no singers, no practitioners of the true tongue, no Greenseers actively maintaining the network in the way the network was maintained when the forest covered the continent. And yet, everything that matters about them persists, not as memory in the human sense, not as something known, something recorded, something that scholars can access by opening the right book, but as structure, as inheritance, as the shape that the world has taken because they were in it for as long as they were. Let your breathing be very slow now. You are deep in rest. The story is moving toward its completion, and the completion is not an ending. It is a recognition, which is something different. A recognition of what is still here, of what was given and received and carried forward across tens of thousands of years, passed through bloodlines and through soil, and through the roots of trees that outlasted the people who planted them. Let yourself be still enough to feel what it might mean for something to persist without being visible. For a presence to remain when the people who embodied that presence are gone. The Weirwood faces know this. They have always known it. The Stark family carries the children's legacy more completely than any other human lineage in Westeros. This is not mythology, and it is not sentimentality. It is the consequence of geography and time. The Starks and their ancestors have been living beside Weirwood trees and practicing the old god's religion in the children's manner for 8,000 years. 8,000 years of proximity. 8,000 years of intermarriage with people who lived closer to the remaining children than anyone south of the Wall. 8,000 years of the Weirwood network's faint, patient influence on the people who knelt before its faces and prayed in the silence that the children's prayer required. The Stark Greenseers, the ones who emerged in earlier generations, whose gifts were noted and then quietly forgotten in the record, were the early expressions of what Bran is the fullest expression of. Bran is the product of 8,000 years of the Pact working exactly as the children intended, keeping the trees alive in the north and letting the trees keep the people alive in return. Jon Snow carries it differently. His Stark blood, his mother's blood, the truth he does not know for most of his life, gives him the orientation towards the old gods. The ease in the north, the instinct for the landscape beyond the wall that his Targaryen father's blood alone could not have produced. He's comfortable in the cold in a way that is not simply physical adaptation. He is comfortable in the silence of the northern forest, in a way that has nothing to do with training, and everything to do with inheritance, when he goes beyond the wall and feels the forest change around him, feels it become more present, more aware, heavier with something he cannot name. He is feeling the surviving nodes of the Weirwood network, responding to a person with Stark blood. The trees are not indifferent to him. They never have been. They have been watching his family for 8,000 years. Daenerys Targaryen has no direct connection to the children of the forest through bloodline or proximity. And yet, there is a resonance between what she carries and what the children were that the story implies without quite stating. Dragons and the children's magic are both expressions of a world that existed before the current age, both forms of power that the present age inherited from a deeper past without fully understanding the conditions under which they were meant to operate. The children's magic was balanced against the specific conditions of the ancient world, conditions that have changed. The dragons are remnants of a magical ecosystem that was also, in its original form, something more complex than the stripped-down version that survived into the Targaryen era. Daenerys is a person trying to use ancient tools in a world that has changed too much to accommodate them at full power, which is exactly what the surviving children were in their final centuries. The parallel is not exact, but it is real. Arya Stark's connection to the old ways is the least discussed and perhaps the most intriguing of the Stark children's various inheritances. She is the only one of them who develops something close to the skin changer's art without intending to, without even knowing what she is developing. Her relationship with Nymeria, which persists across continents and years of separation, in dreams and in the wolf's behavior in the world, is not simply an emotional bond. It is an expression of the same permeability of self that the children cultivated for 10,000 years, the same capacity to exist partially outside the boundaries of an individual body. Arya, who makes herself into other people with a facility that unsettles everyone around her, who can wear faces the way the faceless men wear faces, but with an ease that suggests it comes from somewhere older than the faceless men's training, is accessing something that no Braavosi teacher gave her. She brought it with her when she arrived. The Weirwood trees that remain in the north are not merely trees. This is the thing that every account of them gestures toward, and none of them quite says directly, because saying it directly requires accepting something that the Maester's tradition has always had difficulty accepting. That the boundary between the living and the inanimate is not where the conventional classification system places it. The Weirwood trees are alive in the ordinary biological sense. They are also alive in a sense that the ordinary biological sense does not cover. The network that connects them carries something, call it awareness, call it accumulated attention, call it the distributed consciousness of 10,000 years of Greenseers who dissolved into the roots. That is not biological and is not supernatural in the way that the word supernatural is usually used, but is simply real, present, operational. available to anyone who knows how to approach it with the right quality of attention. The Night's Watch, in its original form, was an acknowledgement of this. The Watch was not simply a military force defending a wall. It was a maintained boundary between two parts of the world that the Pact had agreed to keep separate. The human world south of the wall and the world north of it, which included both the surviving children and the Night King's contained army. The Watch's vows, the specific language of the vows, which speak of being the watcher on the walls, of guarding the realms of men from the long night, are the last formal institutional expression of the agreement made on the Isle of Faces 8,000 years earlier. When the Watch declines, when its numbers dwindle, and its purpose is forgotten, and its members stop believing in what they are defending against, the Pact's last human institution fails, and the Night King's army crosses the wall. What the children gave to the world is not visible in the way that Valyrian steel is visible, or in the way that the Iron Throne is visible, or in the way that the Red Keep's towers are visible against the sky of King's Landing. It is visible only to the kind of attention that the children cultivated, patient, slow, willing to look at the space between things as well as the things themselves. The Godswoods, the Weirwood faces with their watching expressions, the green sight that surfaces in certain bloodlines in each generation, usually ignored or misunderstood, or treated as dreaming rather than as what it is. The ease with which certain people in the north feel the forest as something more than trees. The habit of wordless prayer that persists in a culture that has mostly lost the context for understanding what it is praying to. All of these are the children's gift, not deliberately given, not wrapped and presented, but left in the world the way seeds are left in the ground, patiently, without expectation of gratitude, trusting that when the conditions are right, something will grow. The tree in Winterfell's Godswood has been standing for 10,000 years. This is not legend. This is the estimate of maesters who have studied the growth patterns of weirwood trees, which grow with a slowness that puts the oldest specimens at an age that precedes any human record of the castle above them. The Godswood was there before the castle. The tree was there before the Godswood. When the first Stark laid the first stone of the first Winterfell, the weirwood tree was already ancient. It watched the castle grow around it, and the Stark family establish its identity, and the generations succeed each other across 3 centuries of recorded history. It watched Bran Stark fall from a tower window. It watched Ned Stark kneel before it on the last morning of his life at Winterfell. It is watching still, patient as only the oldest things can be patient, full of everything it has seen and never yet finished seeing. What remains of the children of the forest is this, the roots, and what the roots carry. The pale wood of the weirwoods in every northern godswood, each tree a surviving node of a network that once covered a continent, now quieter but not silent. The green sight in certain bloodlines, surfacing unpredictably but not randomly, surfacing in people the network has been watching across generations, people in whom the inherited capacity has had time enough and proximity enough to concentrate back into usability. The quality of the northern silence, which is different from the silence of the south, in a way that is not meteorological, not geographical, not explicable by any means that the Maester's traditions have developed, but that is, to the right kind of attention, unmistakable. The memory in the roots of everything that happened on this continent since the first children sang to the first weirwood trees in a forest that covered the world. And perhaps most importantly, the possibility that what was given can still be received, that the network is still functional enough for a sufficiently gifted mind to access. that the 10,000 years of accumulated observation that the children poured into the Weirwood roots has not been lost, only waiting for the moment when someone arrives at the cave with the right eyes and enough time and the willingness to sit still in the dark, long enough to hear what the roots are saying. Bran Stark arrived at that cave. The last children gave him everything they had. What he does with it is what the story of the Seven Kingdoms is, in its deepest structure, about. Not the Iron Throne, not the dragons, not the question of who sits in the great chair in King's Landing at the end. The question of whether what the children of the forest spent 12,000 years building can survive the age that their most terrible creation almost ended. Rest now. You have travelled a very long way tonight. 12,000 years in both directions, from the ancient forest at the beginning of the world, to the cave beyond the wall, where the last of the children passed everything they were, into the mind of a boy who had not yet finished growing. You have carried the weight of the long night, and the making of the Night King, and the 2,000 years of war, and the 4,000 years of fragile peace, and the Andals burning the southern groves, and the slow retreat to the uttermost north, and the last vigil in the dark of the cave. You have carried all of it, and now you can set it down. The roots will hold it. They have been holding it for 12,000 years, and they will continue. They do not need your help tonight. They only needed your attention, and you gave it generously. The pale-barked trees are standing their watch at the edges of your sleep. The blood-red leaves are still. The faces carved into the bark are wearing their usual expression, the one between grief and patience, the one between knowing and waiting. And that expression is not directed at anything in particular tonight. It is simply what the faces do, what they have always done. Watch with the specific quality of attention that only things very old and very patient can sustain. Without urgency, without demand, without any need for acknowledgement, they are there. You are here. The story is between you in the dark, in the roots, in the slow movement of something that has been moving since before any name was given to it. Let your eyes close fully now. Let the last tensions in your shoulders and your jaw release. Let the ancient forest settle around you, like the dark between stars, not empty, but full, full of everything that was, full of everything that continues. Your watch is ended. The history will keep. And now, softly, slowly, the night takes you. If this story is finding you in the dark, consider subscribing so the next one is waiting when you return. Every story I tell is a slow one, and there is always another waiting. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.